As we were talking with Tim just a few minutes ago, we've certainly identified a need to talk about rural and cottage properties. And that need has arisen because on the outskirts of the GTA, when you get into the Muskokas or Parry Sound or the Kawartha areas, there's been quite a bit of action out there, as some of you obviously have experienced. And this is the first chance we've had to be able to put together a little bit of a slideshow for rural and cottage properties that hopefully some of you will find very useful. I do try to answer questions as we're going along. And if you know how to unmute yourself and ask, just, don't be shy. Just feel free to cut me off. I generally ask at the end of just about every slide if anybody has any questions. So don't be shy. Do feel free to ask questions, please. It certainly is helpful. And if you have any suggestions or if you think I've missed anything along the way, then for goodness sake, speak up. The other part is, of course, there is the chat button, and I do try to answer the chat questions as they come in. And so feel free to use the chat feature as well. And if I don't answer the chat right away, I will get to it as soon as it's possible for me to do it. And I'll try to answer your questions immediately as soon as I can. So welcome, and we'll start this off here. So, rural properties. What is a rural property anyways? For the purpose of this presentation, a rural property is defined as a property that does not have municipal water or sewer, any size, but in general, it's a larger size property. But whether it's just a regular building lot, kind of that, 50 by 120 feet or 70 by 150 feet, not that large of a property in the rural area, but does it have municipal water or sewer on it? That's really, the real definition of a rural property is that it does not have municipal water or sewer on it. In a rural property, what is the buyer's intended use? And I know that might sound really kind of crazy, but sometimes as a residential agent, you're taking people out to show them houses, of course, and they're going to buy a house, and it's a residential house, and obviously the buyer's intended use is usually to live there, at least for a little while, if not for a long time. And sometimes agents forget to ask that question, all right? And the reason why it's so important to ask that question in a rural property is, what's the buyer doing with it? Sometimes we make mistakes that just because the property is vacant or the buyer wants to live there, sometimes people want to use rural properties for small business. We run into this actually fairly regularly, that people want to live in a rural property. They own a construction company. And in that construction company, they have a lot of trucks, and they want to store their trucks on the rural property. Well, is that permitted? Like you just assume that it is permitted. You can't assume just because it is rural that any use is permitted. Do be careful, okay? You will see on some MLS data sheets, where the zoning is, and the zoning actually says rural, okay? There virtually is no such thing as rural zoning, okay? It's the same thing as that there's virtually no such thing as commercial zoning, all right? When you see commercial on a data sheet, is that actually a zone? No, it's a type of zoning. And rural is a type of zoning. Under commercial or rural, there will be many, 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 many different types of permitted uses in that zoning class, okay? So just because it says rural, that is not a zoning, okay? You have to get more specific than that. And I've given you the zoning conditions to use. And I think some of you have used zoning conditions in some commercial deals already, but now we're talking residential, and zoning is still just as important in rural properties for the buyer's intended use. We had one just this past Friday where it was 16 acres of land, lovely, lovely, lovely land, a real dog's breakfast of a house on it, to be honest with you, from what the agent was telling me. But they wanted to run a small business out of the rural property, build a barn, have a hobby farm, that kind of thing. Is that permitted? You just can't assume that that kind of thing is permitted, okay? Be careful, all right? A buyer might want to do something that may or may not be permitted. If it's vacant, can you get a building permit? And you cannot assume you can just get a building permit, okay? The rural properties that are out there are impacted by all sorts of other, well, not problems so much, but all sorts of other considerations outside of your regular residential property in, Thornhill somewhere, all right? There could be agriculture or natural environmental considerations for any vacant rural property that must be considered. If you're looking at a rural property that's agricultural zoned, changing that agricultural zoning to commercial or industrial is almost impossible. And it may be almost impossible to even change it to a residential zoning. So what happens sometimes when you have a large agricultural property, what happens is that the owners of that agricultural property have, for no lack of a better word, chunked out half an acre out of all the acres that they have so that they can change that one little tiny piece to a residential zoning, and then the rest of it stays agricultural. So you have to be really, really careful. If you're in a rural property that has been used for farming, and perhaps even is still being used for farming, or some kind of agricultural use, the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Government of Ontario in general, is really against rezoning agricultural land. Why? Anybody want to take a guess? No takers for a guess? The reason why the province in general, including all the ministries, don't want to convert agriculture to anything else is because we need food. And they don't want to take away land from our food supply or from cattle or livestock of some sort. And so yes, agriculture definitely you have to be a little bit careful of. If you're running into that in a rural property, you do have to be careful. I don't know, Nancy, they don't make it anymore. That's true. Farmers are protected, that's true. Land is not switched back to agriculture. I don't know if I agree with the last comment that land is not switched back to agriculture. I think if you have an industrial zoning and you want to switch it to agriculture, I think a municipality will do it overnight. It'd probably be the most common one that does happen. Andy's question is, what's the difference between zoning 1 and zoning 3? Zoning 1, Andy, if I remember correctly, is that you have a permitted, a specific permitted use for the buyer mentioned in it, and zoning 3 is a more general zoning clause. Either one of them can be used. But Nancy, switching to agriculture is I think it's a pretty easy thing to do. The government would love to see it. Unfortunately, not too many people want to get into the farming business anymore, and so it doesn't happen very often. Just let me check the chats again. You're welcome, yeah. It happens, but not often. Absolutely, Nancy. Oops, sorry. Natural environmental problems or concerns or considerations with a vacant rural property. In a larger vacant rural property, there may be a small marsh, a watercourse, a river, a stream. It could be a floodplain. There could be an endangered species on the property. Any of these will limit what, where, and even if you are permitted to build. So, you're walking along and it's got a beautiful stream on it. Just as an example, you're on a 5-acre property and there's a beautiful stream running across the middle of the property. sort of, bisecting the property in half, kind of running from left to right, if you want to call it. And so this is great to have this. And so it's so beautiful and it's so pretty to have this stream here. I'll build my house right beside it, kind of thing. Well, you can't. There are environmental rules about streams and watercourses that you can't build within a certain distance from the high water mark of that watercourse. And the key there is high water mark. So you may be looking at it in the middle of summer where the stream is just a little tiny trickle, okay? Middle of August or even now, all right? And you look at the zoning and it says you can't build within 10 meters of it, okay? But what it is, it's 10 meters of the high water mark. So let's take a look at how much water is in this stream in April. And all of a sudden you've got 10 or 15 feet wide of a water course as the snowmelt goes running on down it, and you can't build anywhere close to it. The other problem with this stream is that you probably will not be permitted to build a bridge over that stream without jumping through some major loopholes and environmental checks and goodness knows what, that you're not disturbing a fish spawning bed or something like that. And you have to be really careful because a lot of those things will be denied to you. A marsh, well, it could be a nice small marsh in the corner of the property, but what happens if it rains really hard? Is it a floodplain? Now, whose responsibility is it to check this stuff? What do you think? If it's a marsh, a watercourse, a floodplain, or an endangered species on the property, whose responsibility is it to reveal this information, I guess, or find out this information? Is it the listing agent or the buying agent? Buyer and buyer, Damien and Paula, absolutely. These are not latent defects. These are items that are patent defects. They are available for information to the general public. All you have to do is go searching. I'm trying to make you aware that it's sometimes what happens when you're a residential agent and you end up at a cottage property or a rural property, we're talking about first of all here, we'll get to cottage properties in a minute, is that you go there and you're stunned by the beauty of it all. Oh, look at this, it's absolutely lovely. And my goodness gracious, they have rules in the rural properties. My whole point of this is that they have rules in rural properties just as much, sometimes more, than what you might find in the city here, if you can believe it. Buyers should do due diligence. Absolutely, Christine. Absolutely, 100%. Absolutely.
I'm going to just step in, John. It's Isabel.
Yeah, hi, Isabel.
Hi. And I'm just going to say that when you start getting involved with a lot of these environmental agencies, it takes forever to get answers out of them, especially during COVID. So if you're doing your buyer's due diligence conditions in your offer, you've got to make them long. And that can be anywhere from 2 to 4 months easily, because trying to get permits or definitive answers, you have to give them so much information to get your definitive answers that it takes time, and it usually takes a lot of money because you have to supply them with plans and surveys and all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, Isabel. Thank you for bringing that up. I had not mentioned time, so Isabel is absolutely right. Of course, I don't say the broker of record is wrong very often, but in this case, definitely, Isabel is right. These things definitely take time. Thank you, Isabel.
You're welcome.
So in addition to the natural environmental issues, there are man-made issues as well. What has the property been used for in the past? In addition, what have the neighboring properties been used for? So you have to not only look at, and this is actually, important for commercial properties, industrial properties, warehousing properties, and rural properties. Kind of this next slide is kind of encompasses it all, because you can't just assume that the lands are all we are looking at. What are the neighbors' lands? What have they been used for? Okay, it's really easy to purchase a property beside a gravel pit, as an example. Got a nice, an abandoned gravel pit. And you want to buy the land beside it. There's a gravel pit beside the land that you want to purchase for your buyer. Well, how do you know what's happened in that gravel pit? Because in a gravel pit, what happens is that there's a lot of heavy machinery in a gravel pit. They may also, and so what does heavy machinery do? Sorry, heavy machinery, they leak oil, they leak gas. They spill stuff all over the ground, all over the place. And maybe if the gravel pit's been in existence for 60, 70, 80 years, and this is the neighboring property that we're worrying about, maybe some of that stuff has leached onto the property that you're looking for. Another problem with a gravel pit is sometimes the reason why the gravel pit has stopped operation is that they've run into a vein of asbestos. And that asbestos has drifted over, and now little bits and pieces are found on the neighboring property, and oh my goodness. So it could be anything, okay? So you have to not only consider the land that the buyer is purchasing, but what about the neighboring properties? Don't forget about those. And if you have to do something like this, then it's a phase one. The preliminary, I should say, is what have the lands and neighbors being looked at? Basically, this is a preliminary. Are there any records of environmental impact studies? What have the neighboring lands being used for? That kind of thing. Pretty simple stuff. It's not expensive to get something like that. After they've cleared the preliminary stage, a phase one step comes in, and you identify possible environmental issues, municipal searches, interviews. They walk over the property and they go really deep into the preliminary stage. This will cost anywhere from $3,000 to $7,000, approximately. Depends on the size of the land. I mean, if you're looking at 100 acres, it's probably more. If you're looking at a small piece of land, you're probably closer to the 3,000. I don't think I've ever seen anything less than 3,000 for phase one. Assuming phase one finds something, let's just call it scary, for lack of a better word, you move into phase two, which is an intrusive testing, which drills to obtain core samples, $10,000 and up. Minimum 10,000, and I mean a rock bottom minimum. It's probably closer to $20,000 to $25,000 and up. I sold a house that had a oil furnace, and the oil tank was outside, and the sellers of the house came home one day to their horror and found that the oil tank had tipped over, and it was 1,000-liter oil tank, of which there was about 300 liters of oil. They estimated about 300 liters of oil in the tank when it spilled, and 300 liters of oil went into the ground. And so my buyers liked the house, but they certainly didn't like the story about the oil. So we went digging, and to allay the buyers' fears about the contamination of the soil, the seller's insurance company sent us the bill for the remediation of the land. And the remediation of the land for 300 liters of oil was just around $720,000. So, oh my goodness, the remediation was big, big, big money. And so you really, really do have to be careful with buying a rural property. And you should, I think, always have a condition to protect your buyer. And there's all sorts of them out there. I did 1, 3, 4, 8, 9, and 15. And I know Andy's going to ask me, what's the difference between all of them, Andy? And I honestly can't remember which one's which. I'd have to read them all in detail. But one of them is going to suit us. Some of them are simply the seller represents and warrants that there's no environmental damage to the property that they are aware of. Other ones are that you can do the preliminary phases or preliminary studies in phase 1 and phase 2. And then as an important part of all this is who is negotiating to pay for this as well. Is the seller going to pay for it or the buyer's going to pay for it? So I certainly recommend that if you run into one of these problems or one of these properties, that you have a good look at some of these environmental clauses so that you can try to determine which one fits your needs the best. Nancy, thank you very much. Nancy says, East Gwillimbury had many illegal dumps back in the day, I assume, Nancy, you're talking about garbage dumps. Many people do not know where they are, but the town does. There's a great part, and certainly something like an illegal dump, that would probably come up in the preliminary search. And certainly it would come up at the municipal search stage here. Where was the old garbage dump? What's happened to it? You know, that kind of thing. So you really, really need to be careful about environmental, whether it's man-made or whether it's naturally occurring. Just because it's natural and it's a beautiful thing, it might cause some real problems for a potential buyer depending on the buyer's needs. So do be careful with that. Does anybody have any questions about, thank you for that comment, Nancy. Does anybody have any questions about either natural or industrial or man-made environmental problems? Water and sewer. So in rural properties, water and sewer, we're assuming once again, there's no municipal water and sewer. That's kind of the definition of a rural property. Assuming there's a well on the property, a bacteriological analysis of the drinking water should always be a condition to protect your buyer. If a mortgage is required, all lenders will require analysis result that the water is safe to consume. And they're looking at E. coli and coliforms in the water test. And it has to be less than 0.05 per million, I think it is, for the water, that it's clean and safe drinking water, okay? If it's a well on the property, more lenders will not lend. I have not heard of anybody lending, even if you put 95% down, will a lender lend if you do not have a bacteriological water analysis that there's drinking water is safe to consume. Okay, so it's sewer water 02 is the clause that you would include. Okay, how do you go about getting a bacteriological water analysis? Well, first of all, you generally go to either the municipality or you go to the local health unit and you pick up the sample package that has a kit in it, and it has the instructions on how to get a water sample. There's a few tricks that you can do, but at worst, you should let the water run for 5 or 10 minutes out of the tap before you take the sample to make sure you're just not getting some surface water out of the well. And make sure, in case it's been sitting there for a week or two, who knows, right? And so you want to make sure that the water has been running for a little while. Just let me check the chats here, just one moment. Leah asks, back to environmental. Leah asks, buyer or seller to pay for the testing? So usually, Leah, it's a negotiated part. What I have found works is that the buyer pays for phase 1. They work out something for phase 2, maybe they split it. But if there's remediation to be involved, either the price gets dropped tremendously so that the buyer can do the remediation, or the seller's going to pay for the remediation, because guess what? They can't sell it. And so the seller's going to have no choice to pay for the big bucks to get it fixed. Or if there's insurance, of course, that's a beautiful thing. Nancy Payne, phase 1 or phase 2? My experience has been that a phase 1 does not do, no, you're absolutely right. Phase 1 does not do a soil test. Nancy, just let me go back up to there. I don't think I put it in there. Yeah, so you can see here, identify possible environmental issues, but without a soil test. It's all in phase 2, absolutely. If that wasn't clear, my apologies. Sewer. Assuming that there's a septic bed on the property, to protect your client, you should also have a septic system condition that allows the buyer to have the septic tank pumped out and ensure that the septic material is not steel and is functioning correctly. Prior to about I'm going to call it early 70s, call it 1975, even 1976, septic tanks, and we're going to have a picture of a septic tank coming real soon. Septic tanks were put in the ground made out of steel, okay? Fiberglass tanks were not in existence, plastic tanks were not in existence, concrete tanks were not in existence. Everyone did steel. Now, if a septic tank, which has a lot of water in it and all sorts of other stuff in it, is made out of steel and was installed in 1970. The problem, of course, is rust. And it rusts through. It was a crazy material to use. And so you want to have the septic tank inspected and pumped out and make sure that it's not steel and that it is functioning correctly. That is done by an expert in the septic tank business. And, it's usually the number one guy in the number two business that comes out and does this kind of thing. Fun job. He will come out, open the lid, and pump out the tank and check to make sure that it's concrete or plastic of some sort, and flush the toilet and run the taps in the house to make sure that everything is running properly into the tank, and then hopefully give it the good thumbs up that you're good to go and continue on with your sale. Okay, so here is your typical septic system setup. Okay, you can see they've cut out the house to show the toilet and some sinks and another toilet, and all the drains generally go into the septic tank. So here's your septic tank here, okay? And then you have the leaching bed, filtration bed, whatever you want to call it. And you can see here, and I don't want to be gross or anything here, but you can see here at the bottom of the septic tank, there's this black stuff here, okay? That is, to say for no way to put it, that's the poop. That's the poop that comes out of the toilet, okay? That's the hard solids that come out of sinks, and it gathers at the bottom of the septic tank. And what happens is that the hard stuff gathers at the bottom, okay? And the water floats over these baffle walls, okay? And the water then drains into the leach bed, and only water goes into the leaching field, and the solids stay at the bottom of the tank. You can imagine, well, don't try to imagine this too much, please, but you can imagine that over a long period of time, the poop builds up and starts to flow over the baffle wall, and then builds up and then flows over the baffle wall, and eventually starts to plug this, okay? And if it's never been pumped out, that is why you want the septic tank pumped out, okay? You want it to be opened up, the lid gets opened here. Yes, hold your nose, it stinks. I'm sure Christine, she says she's familiar with the area with septic tanks. Maybe you've been there, Christine, I don't know, but I have. When the septic tank lid has been opened, wanted to see what it was like. And the person who's pumping it out pumps it out and gets down to the bottom here and gets rid of whatever is at the bottom, so that everything is working properly over the baffles so that the water flows. That is why you need to have a septic tank condition, that it is going to be pumped out. Now it's pumped out, I've been asked, should the seller pay for it? Well, you know what? The seller's brother might be the number one guy in the number two business and says he's done it and he hasn't. It's the same thing. Just should a seller pay for a home inspection? Not usually, right? You want the buyer to do this so that your buyer is control of the situation. I think typically, and Christine, you may have a comment on this since you seem to be in an area with it, but typically to have a septic tank pumped out and a quick look to make sure it's all working properly, I'm going to take a stab at $300 to $400. If it's an emergency, it might be as high as $500. What do you think, Christine?
Yeah, absolutely. It all depends on how big the tank actually is. And yes, you are right, John. It is a very smelly job when you're there on site. Also, you may want to be careful, because if the homeowners actually do it too often, it can build up some toxics inside of the tank itself. So you don't want to be having your clients, if they said that they've already pumped it 6 months ago or 2 months ago, you got to be careful. Like, talk to the experts and they'll tell you how often it should really be pumped.
Correct. I agree with you 100%. And the other thing that you don't want to have happen, and if you have a comment on this, Christine, please, but the other thing you don't want to have happen is you don't want to have your septic tank pumped out in the end of November, beginning of December, assuming you can still get to the lid. And the reason why is that what keeps the tank from cracking or freezing, and once again, I don't mean to be gross here, but it's the warm stuff that's in the tank. that's keeping it from freezing. And so if you get it pumped out in early December before the ground is frozen, and then all of a sudden the ground freezes, but nobody has used it to fill it up, and like Christine says, it's the size of the tank, and generally a septic tank is about 800 gallons, quite large, then it takes a while to fill it up. So you have to be a little mindful of the time involved as well. I also want to point out that if you're looking at a rural property and somebody says, oh, well, you know, I'll just put in a septic system, do they have any clue on how much one of these babies costs to put in here? I would say, as a rough guess, to install a septic tank system without a lift pump, so we're talking about gravity fed into the septic tank and a whole leach bed, you're probably looking at a minimum of 12 to 15,000, and depending on the soil, you can easily get into $30,000 to $40,000 for one of these things, just to let you know. So let me check the chats here. Stand by for a second. Raincoat. You like that one, Alia. How often do you need to pump out the tank? I think we've talked about that. You know, Christine said, I think every 2 or 3 years, and I'm kind of on Christine's side there. I think that sounds about right. My ex-in-laws pumped theirs out once every 20 years, but they were cheap. It would depend on usage, but yes, once again, Damien, I think about 3 years, 2, 3, 4 years. Andy asks, what is the depth that the tank is in the ground? Great question, Andy, because you have to get to the lid of the tank. And so in general, the septic tank is not more than a foot below the ground. Very often, you can actually see part of the lid. And so it's really, really close to the surface of the ground. In general, I think the most municipalities today say that the septic tank has to be 8 feet away from the exterior wall of your house. So I have done offers with septic tanks that I've included the septic tank clause, but I've also put in a line that says, the seller agrees and understands that they will have the septic tank lid exposed for the buyer's purposes of a pump out, so that we put it on the seller's end to get the lid exposed. Or how do we know where it is, right? I mean, you know, most people who have a septic bed know where the lid is, so they have to take a shovel and dig down a few inches and they will find the lid. Most people know. I have a cottage with a septic system. I have the GPS coordinates of the lid so that I can never forget where it is. So it was really easy to do. Great comment, Leah. Leah says, if your buyer purchase plans to add an addition to the home, the capacity of the septic tank may not be sufficient. And that's absolutely correct. That's a great point, Leah. Septic beds, the effluent absorption and purification, this area here, is generally based on the number of bedrooms and washrooms, okay? Some municipalities are only bedrooms, some municipalities are only washrooms, some are some wild mathematical concept of both. And if it's an old house with 1 bedroom that's on a field bed, great comment, Leah, on a field bed, and they want to do an addition, there'd probably be a very, very, very good chance that you would not be allowed to do so unless you put in a new field bed, okay? Might be able to still use the septic tank, but you might have to do the field bed, this area here, all over again. You cannot add to an existing field bed. This would have to be dug up, disposed of safely, and put in a new, what are they calling this, a leach field in this area here. So do be aware of that. Thanks, Leah. Mortgages for larger properties. Many, and I should have changed that, you know what, I almost should say all lenders will not loan on more than 3 to 5 acres of land. If the property is larger, 25 acres, the buyer may be only able to secure a mortgage for 5 acres. For example, maybe it's 3 acres, depending who their lender is, but will require cash for the remaining 20 acres. So be really careful here. So the house sits on 25 acres, it's for sale for $1 million bucks. The bank will lend for 5 acres plus the house valued at $950,000. That's all they'll do. Buyer needs an additional $50,000 for the remaining 20 acres. All right. A bank in a large acreage is going to have that appraisal come in, and depending on the bank's regulations, they're only going to appraise for a small chunk of it. So if you're getting over, I asked Katerina, anything over 5 acres of land for sure, but lots of them are only 3, they will not lend on it. Okay, they won't lend on it. So you want to make sure that if your buyer is looking at you going, you know, I'm thinking of buying 20 acres of land, I'm going to move to the country, this COVID bull has got me going and I want to get out of town. You better pre-qualify your buyers before you drive around the countryside. Make sure they understand that if you're looking at a large property, that they cannot get financing for the whole thing, only for a small chunk of it, 3 to 5 acres or less, call it. You know, they can only get financing for that. So be careful. If they're looking for large pieces of land, my goodness, pre-qualify them, you guys. Christine asks, as for mortgages, what about vacant land? Will they lend? Once again, they will lend probably only on a small chunk, 3 to 5 acres of land. Some lenders that are, I find, Christine, that there's a big difference between banks in Toronto and banks in Sudbury, and I've dealt with both. The banks in Sudbury who understand the value of vacant land will lend, you know, at worst they'll send up a good line of credit for you to be able to purchase it. Whereas banks down here in Toronto won't do it. I can give you another example. I used to sell a property on Manitoulin Island, which is, you know, an island 280 kilometers long by 50 kilometers wide. And we've been told by banks in Toronto that they won't lend because it's an island. Well, wait a second. It's bigger than the city of Toronto by miles. And they won't lend because it's an island. So they just don't understand. So yes, lenders will lend on vacant land, but usually, once again, Christine, it's only a portion, 5 acres of vacant land, and the rest needs to be cash. Okay.
Wow. Is that the same for agricultural land? So say if I had a land coming up that's approximately over 100 acres, and if the buyer comes in, they can only get lending for 5 acres of that land?
Well, now you're talking something different, because I have to ask you a question. Is it a working farm or not?
Yes, both north and south of the land is working.
So if it's a working farm, there's all sorts of different criteria for a lender, because the government of Ontario, there's the what is it called, agricultural farming credit, credit farming agriculture, that they want people to buy it because they want people to keep producing food. And so there are other there's, I forget what it's called, Christine. It's agricultural credit.
Okay.
There's something, but so the answer is yes, you can probably get it easier for an agricultural farm that's being used. Okay, so I'm just trying to break in an example here. Christine, you know, asked a great question. And there's all sorts of little loopholes, and there's all sorts of little changes and stuff out there in terms of mortgages, which I'm sure most of you have had the opportunity to experience while even trying to get a mortgage for residential properties here in the city. And, you know, there's all sorts of different things happening out there as well. Yeah, agricultural credit. I'll get the name for you, Christine, and I'll send it to you. I'm just making a note, okay? Any questions, other questions about mortgages for larger properties? Pre-qualify, you guys, before you go driving around Northern Ontario. Pre-qualify if they're looking for, hey, I want to go buy 20 acres. I hear it's great. Pre-qualify, please. My goodness gracious. Okay. Any questions? Okay, cottage properties. So we're defining a cottage property that is on the waterfront. It may or may not have municipal water or sewer, and it may be seasonal or a year-round access road to it. Okay, but the whole key is that we're talking about cottage properties. We're talking about waterfront properties here. So there are 3 types of waterfront properties in the province of Ontario. 1, the owner owns the land right to the water's edge, and obviously that's preferable. You want to step out your front door and walk down to the water's edge and you own all the land. That is definitely preferable. However, There's a couple of other scenarios in Ontario. The owner does not own the land to the water's edge, but has full rights to access the water. Okay, this is what's called a shoreline allowance. All right, we're going to have a look at that again in just a second. Or even worse, there is an easement over the owner's land for someone else to access the waterfront. So somebody has a back property and has the right to cross over your land, has a strip of land, an easement that they can walk over and use the waterfront. Okay, so there's 3 kinds of waterfront properties in the province of Ontario. Shoreline allowances. Shoreline allowances, often called road allowances. Municipalities in the province of Ontario have decided that you as an owner do not get to own the first 66 feet of shoreline from the high water mark of the property. And the key there is high water mark, because water fluctuates up and down, up and down, up and down. And anybody who sold houses in Oakville on the waterfront, if we were also lucky to sell houses in Oakville on the waterfront, they would see that the water level fluctuates greatly. Small lakes don't fluctuate quite as much, but they still fluctuate. And so you do have to be aware of this. So what it is so what I've done here is I've shown you an overhead picture. This is the lot right here. Here's the road, obviously. This is the water. Over here, it was a windy day, I guess. It looks pretty wavy from Google Maps. And this area from the edge of their lot to the shoreline is a shoreline allowance or a road allowance. And this shoreline allowance is not just this lot, okay? This shoreline allowance would continue on down like this. It would continue on up like this. And in most cases, if there is a shoreline allowance, it would basically follow the circumference of the whole lake, okay? So what does that mean? Well, this property owner here with the red roof has the same shoreline allowance as this guy does. All right. Technically, he could go like this. He could get out of his house, walk down his little deck here, and he could cross over here and he could use the shoreline here. Technically, this guy here could come out of his house, which is buried in the trees here, and he could come over here and use the shoreline here. In reality, folks, it never happens, okay? You're going to keep your private part here and your private part here, and he's going to stay private here and private here. Okay, it's called a shoreline allowance. The problem with that's a bit of a problem that anybody can be on it if they have access to it. Somebody from the road can't cross this private property unless there's an easement to access the shoreline allowance. It's as simple as that, okay? The problem with a shoreline allowance is that in general, the homeowner here cannot do much with this land. Certainly, you can't put anything on this land. You can put a removable dock out into the water and you can pull the dock out, but you cannot have a fixed structure on a shoreline allowance. The other problem with a shoreline allowance is that normally there's a restriction on how far back you can build from the water's edge, okay? With a shoreline allowance, they're going to have a further restriction because you have to then build from your front yard setback even further back. So you can't get quite as close to the shoreline with your dwelling as perhaps you wanted to get, okay? So a shoreline allowance. The history behind shoreline allowances, believe it or not, comes way, 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 way back in our history when the Crown, the Queen of England, well, not the Queen then, it was Victoria or George or one of them, said, we need to be able to have a stranded mariner who has run aground with his boat be allowed to land on the shore because of safety issues that or else he's going to drown out here. And private property owners were restricting boats from landing here, and it turned into shoreline allowances. Okay, I know that's a long story, but kind of interesting for whatever it's worth. And you'll see a lot of properties like this, okay? There is a condition to protect your buyer, Shore 01. Shore 01 gives the buyer's lawyer an opportunity to check to see, I'm just going to go to the next slide, to check to see if if the advertised shoreline length is correct, okay, if there is a shoreline allowance, and whether there are any easements allowing other people to access the shoreline. In a cottage property, a waterfront property, could be a year-round home, has the same thing, by the way. Shore 01 is a really, really great clause to include in any waterfront property that you might be involved with, okay? You would be very remiss to sell a property and this person here buys it, okay, and says, I really don't have a good view of the lake, and so I think I'll take down some trees so I can see the lake better. Well, guess what? The whole idea of what a shoreline allowance has run into now is it has evolved into an environmental protection area so that they stop erosion of the shoreline. And it's hard to cut down trees on a shoreline allowance. You need permission from the municipality for sure, and sometimes you need permission from Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Natural Resources before you're allowed to take a tree down. So you want to make sure that you include Shore 1 in your waterfront property conditions. So Leah asks, it's a good question, Leah, what to do if a property has a structure built on a shoreline allowance, i.e. would a gazebo be considered a structure, existing structure, grandfathered a consideration? And yes, there's definitely properties out there that the properties, it's called an encroachment. It's an encroachment onto the shoreline allowance. And yes, it's almost the more term that you're probably more familiar with is legal non-conforming. And it's basically a kind of legal non-conforming, except they call it an encroachment. And because it has been there since, I guess depending on the municipality, how long it has been there for, yes, it can be grandfathered in. And where you find some of this stuff in Northern Ontario is you find saunas that are built on the shoreline that shouldn't be there, but they've been there for so long that it's accepted that it's there. The ministry knows that it's there. It's all good. But Shore 01 will dig into that for you. Okay. Any questions about Shore 01 or the shoreline allowance here? Any questions at all? Guys are letting me off easy. Water and sewer. Now, this is exactly the same as rural properties, okay? If there's a well on the property, same thing. Septic bed, same thing, okay? So same two clauses are used for the water and sewer, okay? But there's a wrinkle because a lot of properties on water get lake water, okay? With lake water, the Ministry of Health, in other words, lake water is not a drilled well. The Ministry of Health states that there must be a filtration system. It's law. Now, you'd hope with a well that there's a filtration system as well for the well. You'd hope that there's a filtration system. If it's coming out of a drilled well, just to be on the safe side, why not? But is it totally necessary? No. If there's a bacteriological analysis of well water that has less than 0.05 parts per million of E. coli and coliforms, you're good to go. However, from the lake, the ministry says, no, you're not good to go if you don't have a filtration system. So first of all, if you're looking at a cottage or a home that has lake water coming from it, does it have a filtration system? And this is, I picked this picture out here just to give, if none of you have ever seen it before, this is kind of what it looks like. These are water softeners, okay? These are filters. This is a UV light, an ultraviolet light to kill any bacteria in it, okay? You must have a filtration system. It would include UV light filters, and a really good system has a reverse osmosis filtration system with millipore filters in it. And you want to make sure that if you're inspecting a house with your buyer, open up the cupboards in the basement and see what's in there. Take a look in the crawl space and see what's in there. Where is the filtration system? This is drinking water. It's really, really, really important, okay? The other thing is that with the filtration system, it's going to tell you with the bacteriological analysis of the drinking water, whether it's working or not, no question at all. But you can certainly have the option of having some inspectors will be able to inspect the lake water filtration system, but you can definitely hire experts in the water business to come and inspect it. Now, in a system like this that has the water softeners in it, often these are serviced once a year by an expert in the water business, and certainly the seller might have receipts from this kind of service that would prove to a potential buyer that the water system, filtration system has been inspected properly, that kind of thing. Or you can amend a home inspection clause to say the buyer will, at the buyer expense, hire a person to come inspect the water system to make sure that everything is functioning correctly and it has been maintained properly. Okay. If I was buying a place, even if it had well water, I'd want at least a UV light on the system. A UV light kills the bacteria. The reason why the ministry wants it out of lake water and not necessarily out of a well is because lakes have animals swimming around in it. And if a beaver poops at your water intake, my goodness gracious, in a lake, you better have a good filtration system before you drink it, or else you get what's called beaver fever, and it's not very much fun. Typically, a second property requires a minimum of 20% down payment, normally. Same rule applies on waterfront properties as rural properties. Lenders will only lend on 3 to 5 acres. So be careful with that. And often what happens with cottage properties, I'm just going to go back to this slide here a second, just show you this for a sec, bear with me. Here, often what happens with cottage properties is the owner buys this, okay, and also has land here, okay? It's separated by the road. The road was built through the land way back when, it's the way it went. The lender is not going to land on the land back here because it's divided by the road. Even though it might have the same legal description, the lender is going to go, wait a second, this is separated by a road. We're not lending on this. Why would they do that? The reason why they would not lend on this piece of land on this side of the road is because it's pretty, I won't say it's easy, but it's pretty simple for this person to chunk this out of this and sell this. And so the lender doesn't want their mortgage to be degraded because the seller, the owner of the property has sold this chunk of land on this side of the road. So do be aware of that as well. Okay. And once again, pre-qualify your clients before you drive around the countryside to do this kind of thing. Do you have 20% down to buy this kind of a property? That would be my first question if they already own a home somewhere else in the GTA, somewhere else. Pre-qualify your clients, guys. You are going for a nice drive, and it's a beautiful time of year, by the way, to drive around up north because the colors are gorgeous on all the trees. But if you're in business and not just sightseeing, it's a bit of a waste of time if you have not pre-qualified your clients. And of course, Centum is always available to help pre-qualifying your clients. Wood stoves and fireplaces. Now this actually applies in town here as well. So this might be a good learning experience for you all. If a property has a wood burning appliance, it's highly recommended that you include a wood stove inspection. It's called a WETT, a wet inspection, which is totally the craziest name for a wood stove inspection is wet. It's the last thing you want your wood stove to be is wet, but people call it that. It's a wood energy technology transfer, okay, condition, or an insurance condition, or both, okay? The wet condition ensures the buyer that the wood stove and chimney meet current fire safety regulations. It's INSP 11, okay? Unfortunately, INSP 11 says that the buyer has to get the wet inspection certificate, all right? That's really, really hard to do because if there's something wrong, who's paying for the changes that need to be done to the system to upgrade it to today's current fire code, okay? So if you're going to use the wet condition, INSP 11, change it to the seller has to provide it, okay? The seller has to provide a piece of paper that it meets current wood energy technology transfer conditions, okay? INSP 11. Your other choice, or both, like I said, is an insurance condition will ensure the buyer that they can obtain insurance, in particular because of the wood stove and chimney. There are insurance companies out there, ladies and gentlemen, that will not insure your property if it has a wood stove in it, okay? Most will. There's only a very few that won't, but there's definitely some that won't. Also, it's always a great question for your buyer to talk to their insurance company, because when you have a wood stove, your premium goes up. Now, is it a lot? No. Is it maybe $100 a year, maybe $200 a year, depending on the property and the wood stove? I don't think I've ever seen anything more than $300 a year to increase your premium for a wood stove. But you do want to make sure that your buyer is aware that his insurance costs may go up. And actually, talking about insurance, and it is INSUR-01, is if you are buying a rural property. This is a bit of a sidetrack from wood stoves. I just thought of it. Probably should have put it into a slide, but I'll just tell you about it now. The problem with some rural properties is that they are more than 10 kilometers away from a fire station, and often in rural properties, it's a volunteer fire station. And if you're more than, and don't forget, there's no water or sewer, there's no fire hydrant hanging out on your front lawn, because there's no water or sewer. If you are more than 10 kilometers away from a fire station or a volunteer fire station, then your insurance either A, is going to be very difficult to get, or B, it's going to be very expensive because the risk is higher. Your place is going to burn down and there's no saving it because there's no fire engine that can get there in time. Little aside from wood stoves, but there you go. Many insurance companies, and thank you for this, Isabel, many insurance companies give a grace period so that the buyer may be able to prove after completion that the wood stove meets current regulations. What that means is that the buyer can contact their insurance company and say, I'm buying a place with a wood stove. I don't have a wet inspection certificate. A lot of insurance companies, I want to be really clear here, not all insurance companies, but a lot of insurance companies will give a grace period, often 30 days grace period, so that either the buyer, and during that time, the buyer signs a piece of paper that they won't use the wood stove, and they either remove the wood stove or they get it fixed so that it can be properly insured, okay? So that counts for wood stoves in the city here, fireplaces in the city here. If you have a fireplace, you should be including one of these clauses, either the wet inspection clause or the insurance clause or both, to protect your buyer. Some back to, we talked about steel septic tanks way back, and now I'm back into the 50s. They used to line chimneys with steel, okay? Now they do it with clay, thank goodness, or aluminum, even better. But they used to do it with steel. Guess what would happen? Rain would get down the chimney from the top and it would start to rust. And it becomes a fire hazard because as the heat and creosote builds up in the chimney, it could start a fire because there's holes in the steel. And so you do want to be aware of this no matter where you are, if there's a wood stove or a fireplace. Right, Isabel has a good point. Check year-round access to property and year-round occupancy and financing on these types of properties. Yes, there are some companies that won't finance on seasonal properties. Why? Because people could break in on snowmobiles in the middle of winter and you won't find out till March, or once again, fire engines can't get there. I haven't talked about land lease properties at all. Christine says, when it has to be inspected, a wet certified inspector will provide a wet report. Yes, a regular inspector. Sometimes regular home inspectors have a wet inspection license as well. Some do, some don't. And so if you're having one of these that needs a wet inspection, you might want to find an inspector that carries both, okay? In closing, talk to your buyer, you guys. Make sure you're looking where they want to look. It's a big country out there. One of the problems that many people are having right now is that we do not have access to the broker listings through the Toronto Real Estate Board, and you can only find things on realtor.ca. It makes it really, really, really difficult to find comparable properties. Hopefully Treb and Ortis get their act together and we'll be able to access this stuff one of these days. I don't know. Isabel, do you have any idea if this is coming down the pipe soon, that we'll have access again outside of the GTA? Have you heard anything lately?
I haven't heard anything lately. The last I heard was approximately a month, 5 weeks ago, that they're working on it, but they're still working on it, and it was supposed to be imminent. So at this point in time, your guess is as good as mine, as good as anyone else's, until we get, I guess, proper word from everybody that they've got it all together. My understanding is some of the outlying boards are fighting the whole thought that Toronto agents can access their properties.
Yeah, understandable, eh? I guess they want to protect their fiefdom, and I guess it's kind of understandable. So, well, I didn't know if we'd had any updates. Thank you. Be sure your clients are pre-qualified. I know I've mentioned it a couple times before, but I just have to really, don't waste your time driving in the country unless you want to go for a nice drive and look at the nice colors right now. Try to be aware of any additional conditions. Watch the MLS data sheets that you do get from the listing agents, and listing agents will send you the data sheet, okay? Read it carefully. And last but not least, and there's a couple of chats I'll get to, try to show properties on a sunny day. By goodness gracious, it makes a big difference if you can show a cottage with the water, sunshine facing west, and it's a beautiful warm day. Always nice. Mind you, when I had to show properties in cottage country on rainy days, I used to tell my buyers, if you like it while it's raining, you're going to love it while it's sunny. And that worked often as well. If anybody is running into these kind of things, don't hesitate to give me a call. Emails work really well for me, and be happy to help anybody out. So thank you very much. Everybody take care, stay safe, mask up, and have a great day, everybody. Take care.